Good morning. I'm Leila Abed, Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Upon taking office on January 20th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order calling for the designation of drug cartels and other criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations to combat drug trafficking and dismantle transnational criminal networks. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 provides the U.S. Secretary of State authority to designate an organization as a foreign terrorist organization upon determining that, one, it is a foreign organization, two, that it engages in terrorist activity or terrorism, and three, that the terrorist activity or terrorism threatens U.S. national security or U.S. nationals. On February 20th, a month later, the Federal Register published the State Department's designation of 8 organizations, which included 6 Mexican cartels: the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco Nueva Generación Cartel, el Cartel del Noreste, la Nueva Familia Michoacana, the Cartel del Golfo, Cárteles Unidos. As previously mentioned, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in consultation with the Treasury Secretary and the Attorney General, has the authority to make these designations. Once it is made, Congress has a 7-day period to block the action before the designation goes into effect. The designation for these 8 criminal organizations went into effect in the United States on February 20th. That same day, the Government of Canada listed 7 organizations as terrorist entities under their criminal code, 5 of which are Mexican cartels. A terrorist listing means any property of that group in Canada can be frozen and gives Canadian law enforcement more tools to prosecute terrorist offenses, including those related to financing, travel, and recruitment. The listing enhances domestic law enforcement capabilities while respecting other countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. While it remains uncertain what new powers the designation of foreign organization as an FTO gives the U.S. government, some of the most obvious tools at their disposal include enhanced legal actions to combat FTO activities, heightened awareness about the severity of the cartel's activities, global stigmatization, and military action intelligence. What remains clear is that a wide range of individuals may be targeted, including anyone that provides material support to the cartels, meaning providing logistical support, resources, and/or financial services. There are severe penalties for providing material supports to FTOs, including potential imprisonment for violators. These designations present a complex sanctions and anti-money laundering compliance challenges for U.S. and non-U.S. financial institutions and international organizations with operations in Mexico and North America more broadly, potentially affecting trade flows and even financial platforms that process remittances. To analyze the implications, challenges, and opportunities of designating Mexican cartels as FTOs, we have invited a fantastic group of experts to walk us through this very complex process. But before we begin the discussion, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We do have simultaneous translation available for our viewers. On the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should see an image of a globe. If you click on the globe, you can choose the language of your preference. Towards the end of the conversation, we will take questions from our audience. If you would like to submit a question to our panelists, please send them to our X account at Mexico Institute, or you can simply submit them directly in the Zoom box chat of this session. Finally, I would like to thank our incredible panelists for taking the time to join us today and share their insights. We would also like to extend our gratitude to the Wilson Center's Canada Institute for co-sponsoring this timely event. And with that, I turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Dr. Tricia Bacon, Associate Professor at American University, who will present today's speakers. Thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you, Lila, and thank you to the Mexico Institute and the Wilson Center for hosting this event. We've reached a real significant turning point. The first time the U.S. has designated criminal organizations on the FTO list, marking a shift from having previously mutually exclusive lists to now combining some of the designations of transnational criminal organizations and foreign terrorist organizations. So we're going to bring you 4 perspectives today. The perspective from Mexico on these designations, the perspective from the United States on these issues, as well as from Canada, and then the financial sector ramifications. We'll start with looking at the ramifications and implications for Mexico. We have an excellent speaker with us today, Cecilia Farfan-Mendez. She's a researcher at the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at the University of California. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Flourish for you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone who's joining us. I'm delighted the Mexico Institute is hosting this very timely conversation, especially in light of the current conversations that are taking place in DC between the Mexican government and the US government. Before I go into my remarks, I just want to emphasize that I'm not a lawyer. So my analysis comes from the perspective of a political scientist who studies US-Mexico security cooperation. So let me start by saying that certainly, and I don't think anyone would deny that certainly fentanyl has caused tremendous loss of life in the United States, a point that we have heard the Republican Party reiterate on a number of times when talking about designating Mexican cartels. However, I would also add that there has been tremendous loss of life on the Mexican side due to firearms trafficking. And so if we want to say, if the objective is to, in fact, prevent this excess mortality that we're seeing in the United States, the problem with this FTO designation is that it's really missing the mark on how the fentanyl market works. And it's essentially willfully ignoring how the fentanyl market operates. And so let me give you an example. When you buy a car in the United States, it is likely that that car actually has crossed the border multiple times in the process of manufacture. And what we're seeing with fentanyl is something similar in what I would call a very North American product. So unlike cocaine and heroin that are produced in point A and then trafficked to point B, what we are seeing with fentanyl is essentially precursors and precursors crossing the border multiple times before it reaches the final consumer. And this matters because right now, what the FTO designation is doing is saying this is all Mexico's fault, and therefore we have to take these steps. So it is essentially, again, missing the mark on how the fentanyl market operates. So let me give you another example. In November 2024, CBP published a public announcement asking key stakeholders to be aware about pill pressing machines being illegally imported into the United States for the manufacture of fentanyl. And this matters, again, because it tells you that this is not only a Mexican activity, but one that also involves US actors. I'll give you another quick example. Also late 2024, in the Southern District of California, there was an announcement about 48 individuals who had been indicted in relation to fentanyl trafficking. And what's interesting about this indictment is not only the fact that you had 48 people indicted, but 37 of those were US citizens and 11 of those were Mexican citizens. And again, these are just two examples to underscore how this is very much a transnational activity and not this narrative of Mexican criminal organizations deliberately poisoning Americans. And I will close this point by saying that 86% of people who are sentenced for fentanyl trafficking in the United States are US citizens, not foreign nationals. And again, this means that certainly you have Mexican criminal organizations involved, but you also have US actors involved. Now, the other thing that I will say around why I believe this FTO designation is not necessarily going to achieve, the purported goal of prevent these deaths is that while you have this designation, what we're seeing on the ground, and I'm sure Craig will get into this point more, is that resources are actually being distracted from enforcement against criminal organizations to immigration tasks. And so on the one hand, you have this designation, but on the other, you have resources that should be paying attention to what's happening in criminal markets being now asked to move into immigration enforcement. So essentially, you have this designation, but at the same time, these resources are not where they're supposed to be. And to close this first round of comments, I will end with this. Of course, this FTO designation, the other thing that it's doing is really eroding the principle of shared responsibility that has taken Mexico and the US so long to get to. This idea that if we want to secure North America, we have to work together to achieve it. And it's really moving us back into that unilateral world where the US single-handedly decides who is doing enough and who isn't doing enough. And we have seen from that period of time that world where the US basically chastises its neighbors and partners is not the most effective one for, in fact, achieving security. Now, What I will say is within this world, and we can get this into the next round, is because FTO designation means that you have to, or you can take action against those that provide material support. This opens a window of opportunity for Mexico to further push the argument of around firearms trafficking into Mexico. And so I'll get into that more in the next round, but I'll close with those remarks. So it's not all bad news. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for those cautionary remarks and some other potential benefits that we may talk about later. To talk more about the U.S. Implications of these designations, which are fairly significant, we have Dr. Greg Deer with us. He's a professor of national security at the College of International Security Affairs in Washington, D.C. Over to you, Craig.
Hey, thanks very much, Tricia, and good morning to all. Thanks to the Wilson Center for arranging this very timely and very important session. I'd like to start by noting that my remarks are my personal views. They don't represent the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. And I should also point out that I come at this from a national security and defense perspective, not necessarily a law enforcement perspective. And I'd like to and I'm interested in this theme because I'm concerned with maintaining what had been up till a recent time been an increasingly cooperative security and defense relationship between our two countries. And that has been weakened over the past several years, and I'll get into that for in just a second. And my focus, therefore, is on these transnational criminal organizations and what we can collectively do about them. So with that said, let me just make the following points. In the past 20 years, and we continue to call them cartels, but if they were once cartels where they kind of collaborated, they are no longer collaborating. And they have moved from what we used to call drug trafficking organizations almost exclusively to what is increasingly the term transnational criminal organizations. And over the years, we have seen the literature deal with this from characterizing these TCOs as being somewhat similar to criminal insurgency organizations. Some analysts have called these organizations a threat, not just a nuisance, but a threat to the international security environment. And some more recent analysis, in fact, a partnership that came from American University with Insight Crime, about the nuances of how to characterize and how to understand these TCOs to better attack them. And I think analysts on both sides and policymakers on both sides need to keep that in mind as they deal with this. That we know these TCOs are delivering not just drugs, but all sorts of illicit goods and services. And to Cecilia's point, that's the fentanyl case is a great case to study. So what we have seen, unfortunately, back to this era of greater security collaboration, it started to fade, obviously, with the arrival of the first Trump administration. But curiously, as everyone probably here knows, President Trump and President López Obrador got along pretty well. But during the second half of the López Obrador sexenio, we saw how with the Biden administration's failure to really control the border, we saw migration become weaponized. Migration had typically been I thought about it as an economic issue, right? Supply and demand for cheap labor. But other actors began to weaponize migration. And of course, the fentanyl that Celia mentioned is also important. So we see this increasing challenge, this national security challenge now on our border. And it was during this time that we saw a reduction in effective law enforcement and intelligence cooperation between the two countries. And that's, during the AMLO sexenio and his policy of abrazos no balazos, we in fact saw an increase in homicides and disappearances. Just to make the point, during the Salinas sexenio, 76,000 deaths, an average of 35 a day. Of course, that jumped during Calderon, 120 over the sexennial average of 55 a day. But during AMLO's sexennial, with the policy, again, of abrazos no balazos, it rose to 180 and an average of 95 homicides a day. And again, that's without taking into consideration the number of desaparecidos, right? The disappeared ones, because, you know, it's easy, if they don't count because you can't find them, well, that reduces the threat, allegedly. So, and this is all despite the policy of militarizing the country, despite the disappearance of the federal police force, despite the creation of the Guardia Nacional, or the operationalization, I should say, moving it under Sedena. So the growth of the TCOs is as high as it's ever been, and the question is, what is to be done? And I view the designation of as a foreign terrorist organization just another tool in this administration's toolbox. And like any tool, it can be employed well to great effect, or it can be abused. So we have to be very careful about that. And again, as Celia mentioned, many of these criminal organizations are acting in the U.S. Well, that provides the U.S. the tools to go after them. I think that's a wonderful thing. So let me conclude with this, and we can get into this in Q&A. Among the concerns here is the domestic policy situation on both sides of the border. In the case of the U.S., the U.S. may want to cooperate more closely, but the base may not let them. Hence, they may be inciting us, I should say, to intervene. And in Mexico, even though perhaps the president wants to cooperate more closely with the U.S., her base doesn't want that, which might lead to an outcome that neither side wants. So let me conclude there, and we'll continue this conversation. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much for those remarks, Craig, to put the situation in the United States in context. Next, we have Christian Loypret. He's a distinguished professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University in Ontario, and he can provide us with a perspective of how Canada is approaching these designations and its approach to the U.S. in this way. Christian, over to you.
Thanks, Tricia. So I'll provide some strategic context, some of the background dynamics. I'll talk about the listing regime, the benefits of listing, provide some analysis in the context of TCOs, and some of the implications. So the Kingston dispensation is the most important constitutive norm in the Canada-US defense and security relationship. And it has two dimensions. It has a normative dimension, so that we're the best of friends, and it has a behavioral dimension, which is the security community between Canada and the US. The remarks today concern the aspects of the security community, so as to say the behavioral aspects. In August 1938, President Roosevelt said he would not stand idly by if Canada's physical security were threatened. And then Prime Minister Mackenzie King reciprocated by pledging that Canada would ensure that nothing it did would jeopardize the physical security of the United States. But the US assessment, and not just by the Trump administration, but by the Biden administration, by Congress, has been that there has been from Canada a proliferation of illicit cross-border trade vectors that the US now perceives as having become a strategic threat. So those include the precursor chemicals, fentanyl, financial crime, human smuggling, as well as products produced with forced labor brought in through Canada to the US. There are two dimensions to this. There are sins of commission by the Canadian government. There are sins of omission. So one of the sins of commission is, for instance, the change in visa requirements for Mexican nationals in 2016. A sin of omission is not having realized the extent to which, in particular, the Jalisco and Sinaloa cartels shifted their production and distribution operations to Canada during the pandemic. And that brought them inside the Canada-US perimeter, and they're now overproducing for the domestic market, which generates some rather modest spillover effects. Now, these issues have been well known for years, and the Canadian Embassy cautioned the Canadian government about this over a year ago, that this was becoming a hot issue among US political discourse, but Canadian government decided to dither on a political decision for electoral, ideological, and pragmatic reasons. The result is, when you slow down a political decision or not making one, it narrows your margin for maneuver, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. But the government then further narrowed its margin for maneuver by making two political decisions. One is for the Prime Minister to resign, and the other one is to prorogue Parliament. This way, on the one hand, they wouldn't have to face the music for the decisions of the past, but they also wouldn't have the ability to make major fiscal allocations or to make major legislative changes. So that means the caretaker government now is left with two options: change regulation or change policy. And so designating cartels as terrorist organizations is already announceable. It's easy to do. It doesn't really have financial implications, reputational or political costs, and it gives the impression that the Canadian government is doing something. So this is sort of the standard performative announcement that has been popular with the current government, where I'm looking for what are the measures for implementation and the measures for the effect and to what end. There's no money, no people, no legislative changes and the like attached to this. But there are some real implications. So the terrorist listing regime in Canada lists as reasonable grounds for belief that an entity has knowingly carried out, attempted to carry out, or participated or facilitated a terrorist activity, or has knowingly acted on behalf of, at the discretion of, or in association with such an entity. This is important because the critics will say that this is government overreach. Where's the ideologically motivated violent extremism component? But of course, cartels are well known, for instance, for kidnapping politicians and influencing political decision-making through the strategic deployment of violence. So that meets condition A. And there's also some evidence with the crime-terror nexus that there's some collaboration under some circumstances with some transnational terrorist organizations. And so that may meet condition B. So we will meet at least A and also possibly A and B. There are considerations that the Canadian government takes into account when making these political decisions. First is it has to meet the legal thresholds that I just walked you through. And of course, before that, it has to meet intelligence thresholds. It also considers the foreign policy and the military implications of those decisions, and it considers the impact on Canadians. Now, what are the benefits of listing cartels as TCOs? One is a disruptive benefit, and there are two aspects to that. One is that it is going to make it more difficult to move money through Canadian financial institutions. We know that this is a challenge. You're all familiar with the criminal conspiracy plea by TD in the United States with regards to fentanyl and organized crime-related behavior. The second is admissibility. So if you're not a Canadian citizen, if you're now a refugee applicant or for any other way coming into Canada, it gives the officers ability not to admit you to the country. There are also intelligence and investigative benefits. So for financial institutions, it lowers the ability for them to debank individuals who are associated or they think might be associated with certain TCOs that have been designated. And it also provides easier warranted activity for security and criminal intelligence investigations. You can see how this listing also expands the terrorist regime and the terrorist listing regime. 84 groups and 2 individuals had previously been listed. Those had initially been primarily domestic, international, and transnational terrorist organizations as we conventionally understand them. Then in the government listed after 2021, 4 right-wing extremist organizations, and it has now listed 7 transnational criminal organizations. So you can see the expanding nature of the regime. Now, what does this tell us? And what does it tell us especially about Canada's national security posture? So the question is, do these organizations really rise to the level of national security? Well, you can see that there's clearly a legal case to be made, but is this also a matter of securitization, of a challenge that we should be able to detect, disrupt, deter, and contain if we had a better and more robust national security posture? And of course, the current government has had a slate of potential reforms it could have engaged in over recent years, but opted not to. And so I'll leave it for the audience to decide on the balance of probability what is the more likely outcome here. And I'm glad to be part of the Three Amigos conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian, for that important perspective on the implications of this. And we'll wrap up with Narciso Campos Cuevas, who is a partner for the Global Capital Markets Practice at White & Case in Mexico City. And he will talk about an angle of this that I know a lot of people are interested and concerned about, which is the financial sector implications. Over to you, Francisco.
Thank you so much. And I guess regardless of how we got here, we're here. And one of the first the consequences of the first order consequences that we foresee, obviously, relate to consequences in the financial sector and specifically on the banking sector. We've seen in Latin America, but mostly in the rest of the world, whereby designations of the sort have happened. A phenomena called that you guys, most of you guys might be familiar with, which is de-risking, which is the decision of large financial institutions to stop doing business with certain areas, with certain sectors of the economy, and frankly, in some cases, it has been something widely seen in whole regions. In the case of Mexico, this is a G20 country that has a financial system that is fully compliant with international standards. I mean, all of us that are in the financial sector have a running joke that we are always the best student in the classroom in terms of adopting the standards set up by the BIS, by the FSB, and in general, in this case, by FATF. We fully implemented the FATF recommendations, which include not only the AML portion, but also the CFT part. So the first question is, what will this mean for the whole system as a whole? In the sense that what needs to be done differently, if any thing, and how to approach the application of the new laws and powers and authorities in connection to the relationship of Mexican banks with correspondent banks and Mexican banks doing business in Mexico. Back in 2014, there was some de-risking concerns as to the Mexican financial system, and those were addressed back then through what we called an educational effort, in the sense that Mexican banks had to figure out a way to give comfort to their correspondent banks as to the types of controls, systems, and protocols that they have to address AML CFT. Back then, there was success in the sense that there was cooperation by both private and public sector of both countries, which resulted in modifying the legal framework to allow for more information sharing amongst banks. This time around, we foresee that a new, allow me to call it, a educational effort will need to be done both with the private and the public sector, with the three countries, by the way, now that Canada has also included the cartels as terrorist organizations, whereby all of the three countries have to understand and have to have a common understanding of what the expectation of the financial system will be, the precedents that have been seen in courts, in prosecution cases, and what are the standards that are going to be held up to the whole financial system. Because we might think of this as an issue for the Mexican financial system, but the way our economies are intertwined, this is going to be an issue for the financial systems of the three countries, which, by the way, also include substantial foreign investment amongst our countries, whereby you have Canadian banks operating in the US and Mexico, US banks operating in Mexico and Canada, and Mexican banks also carrying out financial activities in the US. So our first take is that we have to take stock of what we're currently doing, specifically in Mexico, because this is mostly where the cartels operate, but as others have said before me, the cartels operate in all of the countries. Figure out what needs to be modified. And here, I guess the main difference that we have to be aware of is that previously we did not have a formal terrorism issue in the region, and specifically in Mexico, or concern in Mexico, because I don't want to say proper, but what was formally designated as terrorist organizations had not necessarily a substantive or substantial operation in the country. And but now that there's an issue because of this designation to the cartels, we have to figure out ways to make sure that that financial institutions are not part of the substantive support threshold. And the main difference that I was going to get to is that on the AML side, which is something that we dealt with very much for the last 20 plus years, financial institutions are more concerned of where the money comes from, so that the money of the bad guys doesn't get into the financial system and they're forward. But on the CFT side, the main concern is, regardless of whether the money comes from the bad guys or is legitimate money, that the money doesn't flow to support terrorist organizations, in this case, the cartels. And that's a little bit of a different mindset, different types of controls, different types of tools for information sharing that are going to be needed. And but again, conversations need to be had with private sector and with public sector in all of the countries as to the right expectations to avoid unintended consequences. And I'll close with this. And the main reason to avoid unintended consequences is not because we want to make sure that financial companies, financial institutions continue to do well in business or to do business. It is because we need to be conscious that pushing out all of the flows and de-risking in geographical areas or in specific areas of the economy will result in less visibility and probably less tools for governments to really fight crime. So we need to make sure that because of the designation, each of the players, specifically the financial institutions, understand what the expectation is, how to proceed, and everybody is under a same sort of understanding, so that the tool results practically in something effective for the purposes it was meant to do, which is fight crime, fight cartels, and help on the health crisis that the US is going and Canada is going through on the fentanyl front. I'll leave it like that as such, and then happy to receive any questions. Back to you, Tricia.
Great, thank you so much. A lot to think about here. And maybe the best place to start our discussion is with the big question. And that is, how much effect do each of you think that these designations will have in terms of weakening the cartels? And I ask that because there's a lot of misconceptions about what an FTO designation does. These were organizations that were already designated by the United States as transnational criminal organizations. So there were already asset freezing, immigration consequences, et cetera. There are no intelligence or military authorities that come with an FTO designation. This is commonly misunderstood. And I like to cite that the Afghan Taliban was never a foreign terrorist organization. So clearly you can have military authorities to go after groups that are not FTOs. And there are currently FTOs that are barely still operating. We clearly don't use that kind of military force. So that's a sort of common misconception. And an FTO designation does not provide additional intelligence authorities either. The president has the ability to set those priorities, but an FTO designation doesn't provide that. So the key thing an FTO designation provides is this material support charge. Of course, it has the informal sort of effect of projecting more threat, probably in part for Americans, where terrorism is seen as a higher level threat, when in fact that's probably not the case domestically anymore. But the big key component to this is the material support charge. So I wonder for each of you, how much effect you think that these designations will have in really weakening the cartels. And Cecilia, maybe it's best to start with you, and we'll go kind of in the order of speakers.
Thank you. Well, to the extent that criminal activities are transnational and the response is not transnational, I see this designation having very little effect. But let me share a concern, and then two things that I think could be interesting within this new world, as Narciso pointed out, that we find ourselves in. One thing that I think is a big concern, and someone mentioned this in the Q&A, is the issue on demand. And I think certainly what the FTO designation misses the mark on is that, again, to the point of eroding the principle of shared responsibility, is that it also removes the focus on what's happening on the demand side in the US. And with this, I don't mean to say, oh, well, the US should take care of demand and then we shouldn't have this problem, but rather this really puts people who use drugs in a very tough spot, because the response is becoming against one that is punitive rather than one that is based on public health. And it's very interesting because, for instance, there's research that just came out that shows that when you have big seizures at the border, that actually creates more deaths because you have more adulteration happening in the supply. And so this is not to say that we should not be interdicting drugs, but I will say, and this is kind of one of the opportunities that I see, I think this is a time that we should reimagine how we measure border security and how we understand a border that functions well. I think it is frankly ridiculous that it is 2025 and the way that we measure border security is how many people you arrested and how many drugs you seized. Frankly, indicators should be more sophisticated and we should be working towards that. And I think that would be very beneficial, specifically for Canada and Mexico, because it would also allow us to move away from that punitive narrative around the border that we see right now, in terms of, a border that does not work, a border that is in crisis, and so on. So I have, that concern, certainly on the demand side. The other thing that I would say with this material support element that you mentioned is that this could become a pressure point, certainly for Mexico, and to the extent that Canada wants to join in this, because firearms trafficking not only happens to Mexico, it also happens in Canada from the US, to put pressure on this. Certainly, I do not see an appetite on the Trump administration to prosecute US citizens, because again, a lot of the framing around this designation has to do with foreigners who are doing terrible things to unsuspecting and innocent American citizens. But I think Mexico should really use this, again, given that this is the world that we find ourselves in right now, to put pressure on, well, if you want to stop and weaken the activities of these groups, then you should really pay attention to those who participate in firearms trafficking. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was an important step in addressing, for instance, straw purchasing, but this could, take it a step further. So I think this provides an element, again, for Mexico to put pressure. Again, I reiterate, I don't see a lot of appetite on Trump administration to prosecute US citizens, but I don't think Mexico should abandon, this material support clause. So I'll stop there to hear also my colleagues.
Craig, turn to you.
Yeah, so what effect will this have? I think it all comes back to political will on both sides of the border. If in fact, and to Cecilia's immediate point, if the US fails to utilize this tool to go after both US and foreign citizens that are operating illicitly on its own soil, well then shame on us. I think it will be the effect will be in direct proportion to the political will, in this case in the US, to attempt to clean up its own house domestically, as well as to collaborate more effectively with her neighbors. Someone mentioned demand, of course, right? That's back to the shared responsibility. That was a huge improvement back during the Obama administration to finally admit that there was a demand component, something that we'd never kind of recognized, and we don't pay enough attention to that. But that's a separate issue. If we're going to talk about the dirty little secret in the room and US demand, well, let's talk about corruption as well, right? And so what political will is there in Mexico to attempt to tackle that? We know that during the AMLO sexenio, he promised that he was going to go after it, and yet arguably, at least according to Transparency International, corruption actually increased, right? So for me, this all comes back to how serious are we going to be on both sides of the border to recognize the seriousness of this threat of transnational criminal organizations. And again, back to the tool that the FTO designation provides, if we utilize it correctly, we can be more effective. And that should be, I mean, it's follow the money, right? That's the lifeblood of these TCOs. That they are not terrorist organizations in the classic sense of having some ideology that they're following. They utilize terrorism as a technique to achieve their goals, whether it's to terrorize or intimidate a political figure or a community. But this designation alone is perhaps a necessary but largely insufficient tool. Are we as neighbors willing to collaborate more effectively across the realm? Intelligence, law enforcement, defense. To your point, Tricia, thank you for pointing out that this provides no authority. This idea of U.S. Special Operations Forces or a U.S. drone strike in Mexico uninvited is, to me, very concerning, and I hope everyone understands that should not be an option on the table. And let me just stop there to emphasize that.
Christian, please go ahead.
So when we talk about effects, then inherently we talk about ends. And when we talk about ends, then we can also have a conversation about the ways available, so how we achieve this, and the means, that is to say, the resources that we allocate. And I think one of the ends that we're clearly not achieving or trying to achieve here is to reduce the number of fentanyl deaths and overdoses in Canada, because, of course, we've had 5,000 of these a year for the last decade. And it's a bit tragic that the government only reacts now that it's being prodded by the Trump administration. But there's a host of other effects, I think, that we are achieving. One is, of course, a signaling effect. And I think first and foremost to transnational criminal organizations that Canada will not tolerate being exploited as a weak link. There's also, I think, an audience effect intended here to, in particular, the new U.S. executive in terms of the administration, that Canada does have America's back and will do what it takes, and that perhaps there's a misperception by the U.S. administration. And the third is also interesting enough to allies. And I think this is perhaps also what the administration is trying to achieve, that allies have to be more robust in their posture to make sure that they don't become a threat to or have threat vectors to the United States. There's also, I think, I mean, as I already said, there's a financial effect in terms of the financial institutions. Canadian banks tend to be quite conservative. They're already pretty aggressive at demarketing, debanking individuals, high-risk individuals, and so that will heighten, I think, that effect, and it'll give them the baseline to do that. There's unfortunately very little cooperation between the federal government and the private financial institutions in terms of financial intelligence sharing. That's certainly something that could be improved, and it has the admissibility effect that I already talked about. Then there's also the question about why not designate, if we want to really have effect here, why not designate all the TCOs that are operating? Because, of course, the cartels, for instance, it's the Chinese triads that launder much of the gains in Canada from the cartels, and it's Asian organized crime that runs some of the distribution and some of the supply chains. So perhaps a more integrated approach. And then there's, of course, the broader need for systemic reform, so that there's the challenge around financial resources, human resources. We've had a civil service in Canada that grew by 45% over the last 10 years, but all the uniformed organizations, CBSA, RCMP, Canadian Armed Forces, are short on staff. And so if we really want to level the criminogenic asymmetries between Canada and the United States, there's perhaps an opportunity here to engage in more sort of systemic reforms. But just to kind of conclude on what I think we do see is the struggle that all governments have to cope with the changing nature of borders, right? That our institutions are set up to guard border security, to manage them in terms of territory and in terms of sovereignty. But the challenges that we face are all mobility challenges. They're transnational flows. And so how do we adjust our institutions, our territorial governance institutions, to cope with containing these transnational flows? And I think sort of this designation is an indication of those struggles. And to do that, I think we do three things. And that's what this designation also does here, is it signals that Canada is prepared to coordinate with the United States. That is to say, it shares information and is willing to build a common sort of strategy. It's willing to coordinate with the United States, so building parallel structures on both sides of the border to achieve common ends. But that ultimately, these are fairly young cooperations across the border. It goes back to 1970s on organized crime and the systemic cooperation between Canada and US to the 1990s. And I think what this is shifting towards, what we actually need, is an institutional collaborative common regime to manage the border in the same way that we have managed continental defense through NORAD, a complementary regime for the border where we give the border to professionals, we take the politics out of it. And that, I think, would best serve everybody. And I think this designation is one more indication of the need to move to a more integrated regime.
Narciso, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yes, of course. And just adding to Christian, I hope Canada also wants to cooperate with Mexico, because my point that I wanted to make is that I don't believe that this is a magic one type of solution. Not just because of the designations and the way that this will trickle down, if not with proper guidance and coordination. My sense is that it will end up resulting in a lot of red tape and the good guys having to do a lot more hassle to continue to do business, and the bad guys figuring out ways to circumvent this. But if we are really coordinated, and I'm talking specifically of the financial sector, the integrated financial sector of the three economies, and with the proper guidance from the governments, then I do think that using the tools designed for something else, which was terrorism, on the cartels, could end up having some positive effects as to in terms of law enforcement and making it really more difficult for the bad guys and tracking in reality those who are actually supporting the cartels, and then having consequences, and consequences having a result of dissuasion and in general being able to fight off the crime. But just with the designation, without coordination, without giving a sense of what the expectations are, this would probably result in again de-risking, less financial inclusion, and we will not necessarily achieve the objectives that we want to do.
Thank you. That's a great point to end that round on. I have a sort of follow-up question on this approach, which is a number of you raised that this is a very robust market. There's a lot of demand. So if these specific cartels are weakened, there is likely going to be actors behind them seeking to fill that gap. This isn't like you're trying to counter an ideology, right? This is profit, and there's a lot of profit to be made. So maybe this question is best directed to start with you, Craig. I guess my question is, should we make a more robust transnational criminal organization designation, one that has more authorities? Or should we start treating the FTO list as including the worst of the organized crime elements? Or should we get rid of the two lists and just merge them together somehow? What is an intelligent policy approach to take now that we've started this kind of slippery slope of viewing organized criminal groups as terrorist organizations?
Right. No, it's a really great question. I think what is required, and again, let's put demand off to the side, because unless we go back 100 years and start treating our demand or drug consumption as an issue of public health instead of criminalizing it, but that train has left the station. In terms of where we are now, and back to, I think everybody's mentioned the opportunity this provides. And especially talking about the financial aspect, it was the creation of NAFTA back in the early 90s that led to everything else, to us coming closer as a continent between Canada, Mexico, and the US. And the security component followed that. Well, now I think we can make the case, or I could certainly attempt to make the case, that if we recognize the importance of that integrated financial market and the benefit that it's brought all three countries, we need to, back to the collaboration piece, collaborate much more effectively between the three countries to ask the questions that you just asked, Tricia, and then build back to regimes that Christian was talking about. Let's build a regime that can actually work, and it's not a military regime. It's a law enforcement regime that is based on good intelligence and both criminal and others. So I don't know that it's wipe the slate clean and start from scratch, but we do need to use this as an opportunity to get together. And I hope, back to Christian's point, that we can attempt to move politics to the side, but I see that as quite the challenge.
Christian, maybe I can sort of turn my question adapted to the Canadian context. There's been a precedent set on the Canadian side as well. And so what do you think is an intelligent, effective approach the Canadians can adopt going forward?
Yeah, look, as was already pointed out, as I always like to say, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not. And, it's made us incredibly prosperous as a country. But it also comes with liabilities. When you live next to the largest markets in the world, we also happen to live next door, like Mexico, to the largest weapons market in the world. And that weapons market has substantial spillover effects. We live next door to the largest drug market in the world, and that market has significant spillover effects. So this is very much sort of a two-way street, as you've pointed out. And I think, when we talk about demand, yes, sort of there's the criminal market, but certainly my understanding is that the current US administration has significant concerns about the extent to which that criminal market is being fueled, accelerated for purposes of hybrid warfare, for purposes by adversaries to undermine the social cohesion and the prosperity of the United States and of US society, and the concern that the current administration has, rightly or wrongly, with the extent to which Canada and Mexico need to do more to ensure that they don't become inadvertent enablers of hybrid warfare by our adversaries. And Greg made a very, I think, apt observations about NAFTA. I would complement that in Canada with the Pacific Rim strategy in the 1990s, where Canada, of course, reached out to the Indo-Pacific to build much closer financial and economic relationships, but it didn't build the financial integrity and financial enforcement regime to go along with that, which opened up, if you've read the final report of the Collin Commission on Money Laundering in British Columbia, this massive flow of incoming capital, and a significant portion of it gained illicitly through state capture and other means, and the exploitation by Chinese triad and transnational organized crime. And so I think that I think simply sort of changing sort of designations or so isn't going to help us put the genie sort of back in the bottle. Not that that's what you're suggesting, but what it does do is, I think from a U.S. perspective, it's sometimes I find when I talk with colleagues in U.S. agencies, difficult to understand the resource scarcity that smaller partners like Canada have, in particular when it comes to security and intelligence and defense type issues. And so what the designation does, it allows a smaller partner such as Canada to muster its resources for a particular effect that the government is signaling it intends to achieve. But the problem is that we're also not particularly agile at moving along with this, so that, we've had the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, but organized crime has not been part, for instance, of the reporting within that entity. Of course, presumably now it will. So we kind of we shift our gaze too slowly relative to the very rapid, as we pointed out, evolution of the market in terms of the way organized criminal organizations, transnational organized criminal organizations are conducting themselves. And I think also the professionalism. This is a key part, I think, that we're missing, right? So these are not your organizations from the 1980s and 1990s. These are highly professionalized organizations. They're multi-billion-dollar transnational syndicates. They have lawyers, they have accountants, they have their own real estate agents, all of which make their operations professional, but also make it very difficult to detect. So these are extremely complex investigations, and it is very difficult to contain. And so that means you have to build highly specialized intelligence and investigative capabilities, and that generally tends to be much more difficult for smaller partners to do in the first place, and it's especially difficult in Canada, where we have a federal police force that spends 85% of its time, money, and resources basically doing contract preventing for the provinces, and has a relatively small capability on delivering on federal policing priorities. And so without institutional reform, I'm not sure that just changing the designation regime is necessarily going to give us the effects that we're hoping for.
Thank you very much. And maybe when I turn to Cecilia and Narciso, I can ask you if you have anything on that. And I also have an additional question about what kind of federal laws does Mexico need to change, or might it change, to align with this new FTO approach, and provide it with the authorities that it needs to investigate and prosecute more aggressively? Narciso, you want to start us off this time? You've ended up having to be last, so you should be first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess I mean, as I was saying in the first intervention, the legal framework, the substantive legal framework in Mexico does or did or has internalized the standards set by FATF and other international standard setting bodies in terms of fighting AML and CFT. So I would say that if you were to do a gap analysis between our laws and those of the US and Canada, you will find that in some cases even the requirements in Mexico are more stringent on the substantive part. But then there's the question, and this is something that we're currently studying and together with the financial sector as a whole, as to conflict of laws and due to the extraterritorial application of provisions because of the designations and the way it unfolds. It could be the case that foreign authorities would be requesting information, investigating and sanctioning or imposing penalties on Mexican financial institutions and Mexican companies. The applicability of that within Mexico, it's not that clear. We could be in a position, or financial institutions at least in the first order could be in a position whereby they could they would have to choose between complying with local law or foreign law, and even have a conflict of law issue whereby they could be even liable in Mexico because of complying with foreign law. And one easy example of that is bank secrecy. Mexico, as in any developed country, you have bank secrecy provisions that prohibit the financial institutions to provide evidence to provide information to anyone that's not basically the account holder or a certain list of local authorities. So if a banking institution was to receive an order from a foreign authority to provide information as to banking transactions for transactions carried out in Mexico, then they would certainly run into this conflict whereby if they comply, they could be criminally liable also in Mexico. So when I was saying that we really need to figure out what the right compliance of this and the right expectations of this will be, it is because we could be setting up the Mexican institutions, at least in a position where they could have these types of conflicts. So that's something to be determined. So going back to the original question, on the substance side, I would say a gap analysis and comparing to general recommendations by international bodies, we are fully compliant, or I would say mostly comply. I mean, it will be difficult for you to find a gap. But then we have the question as to the conflict of laws between the countries, and that needs a lot of clarity, again, because otherwise you have unintended consequences.
Celia, would you like to chime in on this?
Sure. I mean, I think, to offer some contrast, I think it's important, while I don't speak, of course, on the behalf of the Mexican government, the reaction of the Mexican government has been very different from that of the Canadian government. And I do think there is, throughout, these discussions, Mexico has always underscored, protecting its sovereignty. And I think, there isn't really an appetite to try to look that in the way that Mexico is just aligning with whatever the US wants. And I think what the US has found over the years in working in security cooperation in Mexico is that blasting Mexico publicly doesn't actually get you the results that you want. It tends to be very counterproductive for the relationship. And so what I would say is also where we're finding ourselves in right now is that the trust that you require for security cooperation to work is really being eroded. And, this is not something that has just happened under the Trump administration. This has been happening for many years now, but certainly, to the point that, if you want, better cooperation, if you want, more coordination, the reality is that we're not seeing that on the ground. And this is because that key element that is very hard to measure, but we know when it's not there, is being further eroded. So I would say that part of the challenge to, when you ask about, do we need another robust designation, is that this designation is not just that, but it's being accompanied by, some very problematic statements by the US government, also of the involvement of the Mexican government. And so, of course, there's going to be a reaction to that. And we have already seen the president of Mexico react to that, right, and deny those accusations. So it's not, unlike the Canada scenario where we're seeing this alignment, where Canada wants to show that it's, a good ally and a good neighbor. I think Mexico is in a very different position where it wants to say, we are open to coordinating and working together, but we also reject these statements and these accusations that you're making. And again, I think, before we were in a world where if we had, what we were saying is Mexico and the US need mutually vetting mechanisms for exchanging information. And that ask, at the time didn't seem, that big of an ask. And in the world that we're today, that seems very far away. Like we're not even close to being in that point. And so I think, the scenarios for Canada and Mexico are vastly different. And again, I think Mexico will continue. And I think in some cases, rightfully so, emphasize, protecting its sovereignty.
If I could come right back to you, Cecilia, and ask a question that's coming up in the Q&A, which is what is the biggest benefit for Mexico of these FTO designations, if there is one? Do you see a real clear benefit on the Mexican side for this move?
I mean, I wouldn't call it a benefit, but I would echo Craig's point, right? And I think, again, with the material support, it provides Mexico an opportunity to pressure on an issue that it's crucial for Mexico, which is firearms trafficking. Today, 40% of Americans know someone who has died from an overdose. But homicide is the leading cause of death for young men in Mexico, and it is the second cause of death for young women in Mexico. And, not to mention the over 115,000 disappearances that we have in the country. And so while I wouldn't call it a benefit, I think it opens the door for a pressure point that, again, is important for Mexico. We know Mexico has 2 litigations ongoing right now in the US. The arguments of the Massachusetts litigation will be heard in the Supreme Court on March 4th. Everyone who's joining, I encourage you to tune in. It will be interesting, but I think it allows Mexico to maintain this issue of firearms trafficking, which is not a minor one in terms for security of the region, on the table. But I think, other than that, I see, again, I think there's a lot of cause of concern because, again, it moves us back to that unilateral world. And it's very reminiscing to of that world of the certification process, right? Where the US would also decide, unilaterally who's doing enough or not on narcotics or counter narcotics operations. And I think, again, the evidence from those periods of time is not a good balance. The outcomes are not great when the US is acting in that manner. And so, yes, a pressure point for Mexico, but not necessarily a benefit.
Thank you. Narciso, if you want to speak to that, I also have another question from the audience I'd like to pose to you. I think you've made a very compelling case about the state of the Mexican banking financial sector, but there's concern that there are a lot of companies that don't have compliance systems and that they wouldn't really be able to identify which money that's coming to them from organized crime. And so how do you view this FTO designation in terms of those companies' exposures? And is there certain sectors that are of particular concern?
And going back to whether there is any advantage, I guess we're thinking about the first types of effects that we're going to see, and again, financial sector is quite an easy thing to sector to foresee as something that will be affected. But the point is, going back to Cecilia's point on the arms dealers, but not only that. I mean, when you think about organized crime and the cartels, they do operate in all of the countries. So now provide the fact that providing support to them by U.S. persons, by persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction, or by persons that have a nexus to them, it is a very broad net that will and should result in on the positive side in at least more attention, not only in Mexico but also in the US and Canada, about who people deal with on a daily basis. And that goes back to your second question as to the fact that probably the financial sector in Mexico has lived through and we have the laws of supervision and the controls in a way that's quite strong because of precisely the challenges that we have as a country, and the challenges that have been posed with us dealing internationally within the financial sector. But the point is whether or not the rest of the or specific geographies or specific businesses could be more vulnerable to liability given the designation. I mean, that's for sure. Certainly, and unfortunately, but certainly some geographical areas will find it hard to get financial services, a full suite of financial services, because it is they will be deemed as high risk by financial institutions. Therefore, each institution probably will make an assessment as to whether or not it's worth their while to provide financial services in those regions because of the cost that it would entail, and also whole sectors of the economy. I mean, and it's no, I guess, at least wouldn't be a surprise to anyone in the sense that some of these activities are considered vulnerable by AML and CFT laws and AML and CFT standards. So besides all of the legal framework we have for financial institutions, we also have, as many other countries, a specific AML law that targets activities that traditionally, not only in Mexico, but also in other countries, have been vulnerable for money laundering and for supporting the financing of terrorism. And that includes precious metals, jewelers, transportation companies. I mean, the type of, the list that you would expect to find, yes, certainly Mexico is not an exception, just as the US and Canada, and those activities are vulnerable here. And there will have to be a focus on understanding exactly what they need to do to be fully compliant with what they already had to comply with, and also because of the new standards in the designation with comes ahead.
Thank you for that. Craig, maybe I could turn to you for a question that's come up in the audience. You really have hammered home the idea of political will and cooperation. Though one of our audience members rightly notes that FTO designations don't come with any funding, right? There's no programming that follows them. And in fact, some of the security assistance for countering narcotics has been frozen in the current overall foreign aid freezing. Are there certain kinds of programs you think from a funding perspective and from a security assistance perspective should be taken at the same time as this FTO designation?
The short answer is, of course, sure. Look, Cecilia mentioned a key word that we need to just pull the Band-Aid off and talk about trust. One of the huge issues is the lack of trust between our governments. Our societies, our populations largely at that level kind of trust each other, but our governments don't. And I mean, so in the US, we just went through this election. Half the population doesn't trust its own government. And so, and of course, the society in Mexico is largely distrustful of the US government for a very good reason, right? But so why was there such great success with NAFTA, right? Because there were incentives for Mexican business to comply with all these international norms, because that's how you would make money. Where I would think properly framed in Mexico, given, the insecurity situation is dire in Mexico. We haven't really focused on that, but depending on who you believe, whether it's the former Northcom commander or whether it's former President Calderon, who says, between 35 and 50% of the country is dominated by these TCOs. And the Mexican government and the Mexican law enforcement and defense institutions call it delincuencia organizada, right? No, it's not organized delinquency. These entities, these very powerful, complex, multi-billion-dollar enterprises are, in fact, very sophisticated transnational criminal organizations. If the government of Mexico isn't incentivized sufficiently to go after them, it makes you wonder why, and I don't want to go there, but I will come back. It sounds simplistic, but it is a question of political will. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates used to say, when he was talking about the bilateral defense relationship, he said, look, the foot on the brake of greater, or on the accelerator or the brake of greater mill-to-mill cooperation will always be a Mexican foot. So if you want to cooperate more, we press on the accelerator, we'll do that. If you want to slow it down, press the brake, we'll slow down. I think this is back to an opportunity for the Mexican government to really begin to collaborate more effectively. And the fact that we've seen a couple teams up here and, a call with the SecDef a couple weeks ago, but it's the lack of trust across the border, right? And incompatible institutions. It's a challenge, but if Mexico could have moved, they would have done so, about 150 years ago. They're stuck with us. So let's figure out a way, respecting each other's sovereignty, to start collaborating more effectively for the well-being of the Mexican society as well as ours.
Thank you for that, Craig. Christian, we have some questions that are looking for more elaboration on what Canada's role is when it comes to trafficking in the supply chain. Is it something you see as a growing role that going into the future, it's going to have a larger and larger role? And what is sort of the direction of this between the United States and Canada?
Yeah, so look, it's a really good question. And of course, this is what so much of the debate sort of centers on. And this is sort of what I try to refer to in my introductory remarks between the sins of omission and the sins of commission. And so, and that's where, it's one of the reasons that cartels shifted operations, especially during the pandemic, but already before, to Canada. Because you're inside the Canada-US security perimeter in the way that you're not when you're operating out of Mexico. The supply chain, of course, is also then closely linked to the integrated capability to produce, to distribute, but also to launder. And the trade relationship between Canada and the US, of course, is so huge that it's easier to engage in sort of in trade-based money laundering, which we haven't talked about, which is a huge component of this conversation, but which, of course, the terrorist designation is probably not going to do a whole lot on. And so if the U.S. concerns, Canada has now said it would schedule some of the precursor fentanyl coming in. There's an open source report, for instance, from the city of Delta about the concerns about the extent to which the port of Vancouver is being leveraged on a large scale for precursors and other illicit trade materials coming in, and how, for instance, local and also provincial jurisdictions are simply not postured to deal with that challenge. The report is open access, anybody can download it. And so the debate about, well, then who's in charge of the port? Because the federal government got out of port policing, for instance, years ago. And so we have sort of these areas that don't seem to get the attention that they need in terms of ensuring the integrity of the supply chains that we require. And those who wonder about the supply chains can look up the RCMP bust of the Super Lab in Falkland, BC on October 31st, and the amount of material that was found there that suggests that, yes, the supply chains are a significant and are a growing challenge. And our best, I think, bet on the supply chains is actually a close cooperation with the United States, rather than the punity sort of that we're receiving from the US. Because given the smaller criminal intelligence sort of community and the longstanding trust relations, right? So this is, I think, in terms of the conversation that we just had, the qualitative difference in the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States, that trust, my sense is not an issue. Professionalism is not sort of a significant barrier to overcome. People like working together. They have similar ways or so of doing it. And that for Canada to do better and to do more relies in an integral fashion on the institutions that we have built together. And that means that Canada and the US have this codependency. Of course, we have an economic codependency with Mexico, but we have a codependency on both trade and security. And so these conversations are never just sort of transactional conversations about supply chains, but there's a lot that could be done in terms of, for instance, the US runs a system where it's able to track everything that comes into the United States. Canada has never sort of joined that system in terms of trade. There's things that we could do on the International Mail Center, and particularly in Vancouver, where a lot of this material comes in and sort of in smaller packages. There's a lot that we could do on the reporting side with regards to supply chains. So in Canada, banks have suspicious transaction reporting. In the US, they have suspicious activity reports. These are very different in nature, and I would say that the US system works a lot more effectively. In Canada, we've taken the regulatory function for banking, the intelligence function for finances, and the enforcement function, effectively have them in 3 separate entities. If we could put them into one entity, then that would allow us probably to contain the supply chains better, because ultimately you have to pay for those supplies. And so I think this is also always a conversation ultimately about money. And I think, as Nasisco already hinted at, we have a very expensive compliance regime that gives us sort of a very moderate sort of payoff. And so I think understanding the integrated aspects is something that is still lost, at least I would say, on the Canadian government, in part because when you have conversations with legislators about this, it's just, when you talk about financial crime, let alone transnational criminal organizations, these are very complex conversations, and by and large, legislators don't see a lot of electoral payoff for them in it. And so they don't have the time to wrap their head around it, and they don't see sort of the payoff, so it's hard to get them to pay attention. And so I think one of the things that the current sort of realism that the Trump administration is applying on both Mexico and Canada is it's effectively an incentive structure for politicians to pay attention to aspects that had perhaps not gotten the political priority that they should have received. And of course, the supply chains are an important part of that conversation. But having a more integrated conversation is going to be required for us to actually get at those supply chains vectors.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. Narciso, we have a question that could be best for you, which is there a need for some kind of document that really lays out what Mexican financial institutions need to do to comply with US and Canadian AML and counterterrorism regulations? Is that sort of would that kind of resource be useful?
Well, that's a great question, but I mean, my hesitation would be in the sense that usually for these types of controls and standards, having I guess I'm going to take it back. Yes, but it has to be a living document in the sense that for these types of controls to work and for these types of controls to be effectively implemented in the financial sector specifically, if there are sort of a checklist type of document, then it becomes a moot point and it becomes usually non-effective because it has to be based on standards, on a risk-based approach, on being able to adapt to what you're observing effectively in the market and in the flows. So I have been making all the time the point that we need to have a common understanding as to the standards and the interpretations and the expectations. But I do gotta clarify that this should be dynamic and by nature. So we should have a starting point. We should understand the pain points and the concerns of each of those involved in the application of these laws and authorities. But then afterwards, if we want this to become really effective, it has to be a living document or a living matter.
Great, thank you for that. We talked at the outset about how an FTO designation doesn't actually provide any military authorities, but clearly there's been discussions about military operations. And so there's some questions maybe best suited for Craig and Cecilia about such operations. From a US perspective, if there were those kinds of Mexico, would we expect to see retaliation in the United States? Could that change sort of the nature of violence in the United States? And then for you, Cecilia, what would be the ramifications for the US-Mexico relationship if the US does move forward with some kind of unilateral military actions against the cartels? So not easy questions for either of you. Maybe we can start with Craig on the potential retaliation effects.
So let me be as clear as I can. There should be absolutely no discussion of a U.S. unilateral intervention in Mexico, not even as a negotiating ploy. And frankly, I chalk that kind of conversation to just frankly ignorance of our shared history. And I confess that I was on a phone call between President Trump and President Enrique Peña Nieto back in 2017, where President Trump didn't threaten to send U.S. forces to Mexico. He offered to send U.S. forces to Mexico. And I think he did so because he didn't understand that such an offer would not even be considered by Mexico because of our history. And what I hope is that those comments in the press by certain senior U.S. officials are based on simply not understanding our shared history. Sec-State Rubio has it right. No, the only way U.S. forces would ever go to Mexico is if they were invited. And even though that is an unlikely scenario, back to the danger that Mexico is currently experiencing, that may be a possibility in the future if we were able to get beyond that whole trust issue. But so having said that, and understanding the Mexican military the way I think I do, I can't envision the Mexican military conducting strikes in the US. That goes against their code, their ethic, their value. But what it would cause in Mexico is turning a trusted partner that we've built over the last 30 years into a partner that no longer trusts us, and that would be a crisis of incredible proportions in my view.
Delia, maybe I can turn to you. I think there's something about the FTO designation that makes people think of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right? And the military tactics used against those groups. And so the specter has sort of become quite large. So maybe you could speak a little bit more on sort of the Mexican government reaction to these proposals, Cecilia.
Thank you. I mean, I certainly echo what Craig is saying in terms of like these should not even be considered a negotiating tool. It's truly this is not going to get the outcomes that are desired. I think in terms of what are the ramifications of this, I think this goes back to what I think is a concern that I've had, in the many years I've studied this. And I think it goes back to this very, I guess, cartoonish and pop culture understanding that we have of criminal organizations. And let me, I mentioned this when I had the opportunity to testify before the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and I'll say it here. There is no special narco highway that connects Sinaloa to the United States. There are actors on both sides of the border that take advantage of the licit economy for illicit activities. So there's no like, well, we'll go bomb the 3 men hiding in the Sierra and that will take care of that. That's not how the business operates. And Christian and Craig and Narciso have made comments to that point, right? These are sophisticated operations. This is not, the narcos being over here and then the legal activities being here. These are, connected because that's how these criminal organizations take advantage of the legal opportunities that exist. I think, with what is happening in Sinaloa right now, we're seeing a preview, a very unfortunate one, of what are the ramifications of having high levels of violence and escalation of violence that, does not, again, either is not reducing the supply. If one of the hypotheses was that if you remove Mayo Zambada from Sinaloa and this creates infighting, this is going to have an effect on supply, we're certainly not seeing that. There's no shortages reported, for instance, at the border. And so I think, again, the concern is that this may be a show of force, but ultimately, if the US government is serious about preventing people from dying from overdoses, this will definitely not get you that outcome. And it will certainly erode, as Craig was mentioning, a relationship that has been very difficult to build over the years. And so I think it would be a massive, massive mistake. And I would also add that it will ultimately preclude this Republican wish of having an order migration process, because what we do know is that violence displaces people. And if you were to conduct an action like that in Mexico, you will see displacement, and then you will see people arriving at the border in a way that, we have heard they do not want. And so if you want this ordered migration process, you cannot have these unilateral action in Mexico. These are mutually exclusive options. And so those are the things that I would say.
Thank you very much for that. That's important context. Maybe I'll quickly scoop up 2 questions that are in the Q&A and then end with a question on China for everyone. There was questions in the chat about if migrants who pay cartels to help smuggle them into the United States, are they potentially at risk of material support charges? And the answer to that is yes, that is material support. I mean, you don't even have to provide very much money or very, very significant resources. That is a potential material support charge. And we also have a question about whether cells in the United States are now terrorist cells. And the answer to that is if they're affiliated with the cartels that are designated, they are now members of a foreign terrorist organization. So they are susceptible to that. But let's sort of end our conversation about the implications on this for China, which is of course pivotal in the fentanyl market. Do these designations have any effect on the Chinese calculus about their activities in this sector? I don't know if anyone wants to start this, an answer to this, or anyone's particularly looked at this issue. If not, I can call on you randomly. Christian, is there anything on the Canadian side vis-a-vis the Chinese role?
Sure, there's 2 points there. So one is that the estimated capital outflows from China are about $50 billion a year at a minimum. And of course, that's in a country that imposes significant restrictions on just about any capital outflows. And so the way you enable those capital outflows is essentially through transnational criminal organizations and through trade-based money laundering. So inherently, that's an important component of the conversation. And we know sort of the involvement of Chinese triads in that in Canada, going back as far as sort of the 1980s, but then, as I mentioned, the Pacific Rim Initiative, and so kind of supercharging that whole effort. And we're also aware of, for better or for worse, the challenges that Canada has had with regards to foreign interference from China on a whole host of areas. But I think in Canada, we're not putting together the connection with, we think about foreign interference as this problem of sort of trying to manipulate to whatever extent our democratic processes, institutions, elections, but we're not understanding that hybrid warfare runs along a very big spectrum, and that it includes, there's what I think there's 169 registered fentanyl producers, not taking out any of the illicit producers, and that can produce it, but only 3 of them can produce it for the domestic market because, of course, it's an illicit product in China itself. And so inherently, we need to have realistic sort of understandings of what a balanced relationship with China looks like. And that's very different, of course, for the United States as a superpower that has leverage with China that middle powers such as Canada simply don't have. And where they, to the contrary, where Canada tries and middle powers tradition try not to get caught up in the wedge between 2 superpowers, in 2 rival superpowers in competition. And so being dragged into that is bad news for both Mexico and for Canada.
Well, that's probably a great note to end on. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Really thank these panelists for in-depth, expert answers to some really difficult questions. And I know I learned a lot from all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity. The Zoom recording will be uploaded in the Mexico Institute's website in the next couple of days for anyone who wants to review all of the good material. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending, and once again, thank the panelists. Have a good day.